This is the Darshan Talks podcast. Before this week's podcast, what does it take to bring a drug to market? Darshan will introduce this episode with a recap for the week of Thursday, June 4th, 2020.
This has been a very interesting week. The coronavirus and COVID-19 seems to finally be coming under control. However, this has also been the week of the untimely death of George Floyd and the race riots that have erupted as a result of numerous years of the rights of people of color not being taken seriously. And this is the opportunity for us as a country to do better. At the same time, thinking about health, this has also been a pretty interesting year. And it's been an interesting year for sure, but also an interesting period. With COVID firmly within the front window of most companies, you're starting to see shadow pharmacies claiming to peddle coronavirus cures. And a lot of companies will say, well, pharmacists are allowed to promote off-label. However, the moment you are actually claiming a product to be to either cure, treat, prevent, mitigate a disease state, you're not acting as a healthcare practitioner as much as you're acting as a product salesperson. And that brings you firmly within the ambit or the jurisdiction of the FDA and can expose you to several concerns and potential violations by the FDA. This was also the week in which, with COVID going on, the CDC came up with a list of office makeovers to see if it's appropriate for your company to start bringing people back in. Interestingly enough, if you are going to be using that, make sure that you consider all the different issues that the CDC raises. And if you have questions about it, feel free to reach out to me and I'd be happy to talk to you. As we've discussed numerous times in this podcast, this is also the time in which decentralized clinical trial technology is starting to take shape. So stay tuned, there will be lots more in this area. Interestingly enough, with COVID becoming as important as it has been, this is also the week when a new Harris poll shows that the pharma industry's reputation is improving. So I've always had a concern that as an industry, we literally try to save lives, and yet we are, depending on which poll you use, the least trusted industry. And that's obviously problematic and in some cases well-deserved. There are advocacy groups also coming out, and they are talking about the importance of the patient voice. We've seen that, and I help with that in scenarios where you're talking about pharma companies doing this. But now medical device companies and app manufacturers are saying this is something they should be considering, which they absolutely should be. While we're talking about the COVID-19 crisis, and we're talking about the untimely death of George Floyd, it's important to recognize that we're still in the middle of the opioid epidemic as well. Interestingly enough, the FDA actually looked at a label study that helps clear the path for OTC naloxone, which, as some of you may know, is the drug that is used to counteract an opioid overdose. I also saw a little bit of news talking about the My Studies app, which is an FDA app which provides a platform for electronic informed consent. This is interesting on multiple fronts. Number one, the fact that the FDA is putting it out, which is not a normal thing that I've seen consistently enough. It's also interesting because it talks about how the FDA is taking a step towards digitization. So stay tuned, maybe play around with this a little bit more. Finally, this is also the week in which the Food and Drug Administration and Commissioner Stephen Hahn came out and said that some of the changes that were looked at due to COVID-19 may be made permanent. And he was talking in the context of real-world evidence, but there may be other ramifications as well. So stay tuned. You might find some more information that's relevant. If you think I missed out on any news, or you think that I should be talking about something else, feel free to reach out to me. Let me know what I missed. Love to talk to you further. Until then, stay tuned.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
So a lot of individuals think about why it's taking so long to bring a COVID treatment to the market. I thought this would be a great opportunity to discuss some of the basics, to talk a little bit about what it takes to bring a drug to market. This is a pretty abbreviated version of what companies actually do, and there are different ways around this process as well. But I'm giving you sort of the very traditional, very typical process. Your first is going to be what's referred to as preclinical. There are generally two separate phases in preclinical. One is referred to as the lab phase, if you will, which is where you're doing a bunch of lab testing on cells and on and using chemicals and reagents. So that's one level. The second one is animal testing. So you're going to find an animal model that looks similar to what you already to the type of organ that you're probably going to be infecting into, or that you're probably going to be putting your pill into. So, for example, if you were testing a GI drug, they tend to say that beagle dogs have similar stomachs. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I got some of these facts wrong. I'm not a preclinical guy. But beagle dogs versus, say, monkeys would have, you choose based on the characteristics which one you need. The second one, so at that point you file what's referred to as an IND. An IND, or an investigational new drug application, to the FDA says, look, I've tested a bunch of stuff. I believe that it shows promise. What I'd like to be able to do is test this on human beings. This preclinical process, you often start with maybe 8,000 different products, and you've narrowed them down to just a few that you're considering by the time you get to the less than 100 at the time you're filing an IND. Once you filed your IND, your next step is saying, okay, I want to see what happens. As it relates to in the clinical phase, so once you finish the preclinical phase, you're looking at the clinical phase. At the clinical phase, your number one is, I want to only see if it causes major harm. So you're using maybe 1 to 10 patients, and all you're seeing is, is a limb going to drop off? Is the liver going to shut down if I give someone this product? And this is a very dangerous area, which is why you start with healthy individuals, and all you're seeing is, does someone get harmed? You're not looking at whether the drug works. This process, just the preclinical, can take several years. The clinical process, recruiting, etc., is several months at minimum. Because you've got to not only get the data, but you've got to sort of understand the data, and that takes a little while. So that's phase one. Phase one is, am I going to hurt someone very badly? Typically is 1 to 10 patients. You don't generally call them patients. A better word is subjects, and this is a pretty controversial area, because patients generally have an expectation, a reasonable expectation, of being treated. If you're in a clinical trial, and if you know that someone can be treated, then you shouldn't be doing an experiment on them. What you should be doing is going, you know what? I don't know the answer to this question. We're testing it. If you already know the answer, it's unethical to treat, to test on someone. So that was your phase one. Your phase two is, you know that the arm's not going to fall off. You know the liver is not going to shut down. You know the kidneys aren't going to shut down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens in larger patient populations? So instead of 1 to 10, you're talking about 10 to 100 patients. And what you're often, and again, we're using round numbers, it could be 250 patients, but the general rule remains the same. And what you're trying to see is what happens in general. Does this person tend to perspire more? Does this person tend to have nausea, vomiting, diarrhea? And again, your goal at this stage is not necessarily to look at if the drug works. You're really looking to see what side effects this product has. In later phases, so I'm using these as phase 1, phase 2, but people will often split it up into phase 2A and phase 2B, phase 3A and phase 3B, etc. But in general, phase 2 is still safety. And then there's phase 3. And phase 3, you know that the drug is relatively safe. The risk benefit
works out. So it's not that the drug is 100% safe. There's no such thing. The advantage is in a phase 3, you would have a drug that has a potential drug that you're trying to see if it actually does what it says it should do. So you're looking at efficacy. So instead of testing in 1 to 10 or 10 to 100, you're testing from 100 to 1,000. I've seen phase 3 studies that had 70,000 subjects. But the general idea is you're talking scales and orders of magnitude larger. And again, there are exceptions to each of these. But the general idea is this whole process, just your phase 3, can be multiple years by itself. A phase 2 can be multiple years. So what you're trying to do in the case, and once a phase 3 is done, you're now going to go to the FDA and say, I want to file a new drug application. I believe that the risk benefit associated with my drug, the benefits outweigh the risks. So I'd like to bring it to market. At that point, the FDA may have a few different options, but the ones most likely to happen are we approve it, we deny it, or we approve it, but we still have some more questions. And we approve it and we have some more questions often results in what's called phase 4, which is we think this drug will almost always be taken with this other drug, so do some more testing here. Or we think this drug will almost always be taken in these types of patients, so we want to have more data around that, so you need to do additional studies. So those are post-approval studies, often called phase 4 studies. And this process is a multi-year process, often 1 or 2 decades. And we're trying to bring it down to a year. And in some cases, people were expecting it to be 2 or 3 months. And I just don't physically see how someone can bring a multi-decade process into a few months. There are ways to expedite things, but even if you're expediting, it becomes problematic. I just read a report from one of the newspapers that they're trying to do some studies in one of the big issues that you face is contract negotiation. One of the other big issues is finding patients. Turns out in the UK, the number of coronavirus cases are dropping so quickly that they can't find the appropriate number of patients subjects to be in their studies. If you have questions about what I just described, if you don't understand what I'm thinking about, feel free to leave me a message. Happy to talk to you, or just hit the like button.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.